Hello, I'm hoping it's working now. Yes, it's working now. Hello, everybody, and welcome to my first podcast I'm doing. I will name it the Absurd Podcast, and this will be episode 1. So, the point of this podcast so far is to explore the world. So, I like to call the world rather absurd. There's many different ideas, many different topics out there in the world that I enjoy exploring. And in this podcast, my point is to explore the absurdity of this world. So I will be talking to interesting people and discuss different ideas. And today's special guest is Michelle Catlin. Hello, Michelle.
Hello, I'm glad to be here.
Glad to have you on. So I know Michelle for quite a while, so this is nothing really new for me of who she is. But for many of you, she's a new person. So do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, sure. My name is Michelle. I am a political and cultural commentator on social media. I am active on Twitter. I also have been doing YouTube for a while now, and I've also written some opinion articles and news articles for various websites. So, yeah, it's my main interest on the online is to explore political and cultural topics. So I hope it will be an interesting conversation on this podcast to talk about these issues as well.
All right. And what is your political stance, if I may ask, or what do you
Uh,
usually?
well, the difficulty is that there isn't really a label for what you could describe as my political stance, but it does have a kind of an interesting tradition. I would consider myself to be more culturally on the right while being economically more on the left. If to kind of use examples from the past, think of people like Otto von Bismarck or Huey Long, Eisenhower, Theodore Roosevelt, kind of the more paternalistic form of conservatism that kind of combines a culturally conservative outlook with more economic nationalist policies. So it's kind of like the very opposites of a neoliberal that is more culturally left wing and more economically capitalist.
So economically protectionistic then? Would you define Huey and
Like
Otto von?
Keynesian, I guess.
Yeah, Keynesian, but would you even define Otto and Huey as the same economic stance? It's very
Well,
interesting.
Bismarck implemented a lot of policies that were kind of seen as a precursor to social democracy, kind of a welfare system. I wouldn't necessarily say that they had the same views, but it had kind of the same trend of being culturally conservative, but still kind of giving a general welfare platform for the nation as a whole to kind of protect the what you could see as the working class people. Um, for there are different reasons why I generally support this view, mainly because I see the nation as kind of a an organic system where people I feel like there needs to be a certain duty and obligation to care for one another. But I also believe that giving a general more left-leaning programs helps mitigate revolutionary or socialist tendencies in the working class if their conditions aren't really up to standards.
Let's see. Would there be any political party that you would support that you think hold these ideas in Europe or in America? That is.
I actually think that a lot of nationalist parties or the right-wing populist parties in Europe tend to kind of be socially more on the right and economically more on the left. Good example would probably be the National Rally of France, which is a generally pretty economically protectionist and yeah, generally economically left-leaning political party, while still, being seen as on the right. So I think a lot of yeah, a lot of political parties in Europe, at least on the European continent, already tend to be more towards kind of the labor policies. They also tend to get a lot of voters from labor parties and social democratic parties,
Yeah.
and that's a very interesting contrast to the more Anglican and Atlantic countries like England and the UK, where it tends to be a lot more focused on free trade and markets and these kind of things.
Yeah. But wouldn't then the Social Democrats, like the Social Democratic parties of Europe, what do they lack? Because if they are pretty much the same economically as the national right, what are they lacking in social democracy for you to, let's say, vote on them in the future if they change?
I think um, I think when it comes to 21st century politics, I think a lot of like you can kind of divide politics in different eras. Um, for example, the earliest signs of like political divide would probably have to be like the aristocrats versus the bourgeoisie during the French Revolution, for example. So you had like the royalists and the Jacobins, or the Tories and the Whigs, and then it kind of evolved towards the bourgeoisie becoming more on the right as they gain more power, and the left being more defined by like labor movements and social democracy. And now I'm seeing kind of a new alignment where I think the um, perfect balance kind of for the general population, what I think the general European population at least believes in, is cultural issues on the right when it comes to like immigration and other social issues, and being not necessarily like socialist but left leaning to like welfare programs. And I think a party that can mix um, a right wing perspective on identity and a left wing perspective on economics, I think that is the formula that you really need to be a pretty successful party in the current era of politics. And I think what a lot of social democratic parties lack is that they used to define themselves as labor movements, but they have steadily over time grown into a more upper class, kind of an upper class city based movement that is
Yeah.
more focused around culture and identity on the left, and environmentalism, and the working class that doesn't really appeal to the working class. You know, things like LGBT rights and multiculturalism, the working class isn't interested in those ideas. So I would say what the social democrats are lacking is that they have been abandoning the more labor class based politics of the 20th century in favor of more more of a upper class bourgeoisie cultural left wing ideal. And I think that's what they are lacking.
And that I can actually agree with, like, of my own exploration of political ideas in Sweden. I know that the left wing party, which is supposed to be the working man's party, they stand more for the ideas of the urbanite middle class with their identity politics and feministic concerns. So I do agree with that. But many of the new right wing positions, national populistic positions, they also intermingle with the already existing conservative right. And so, for example, the like certain Christian democratic groups or other very conservative groups. What's your issue with them in particular, with, let's say, the Christian Democrats? Is it just economically, or do you think that they also culturally are not on your side?
Well, if we're talking about like Christian Democrats on like the European continent,
Yes, European continent.
like the CDU, or you know, um, because in general in my country and in, for example, Germany, a lot of the Christian democratic parties tend to be very
centrist.
liberalized, to explain it more. They tend, I think, a good example would probably be Ireland. In Ireland, you have I can't really pronounce the political parties, but you have Fine
Fine
Gael,
Gael and Fianna Fáil.
yeah, Fianna Fáil. And those
Yeah,
two political parties, Fianna Fáil would be more the Christian Democrat equivalent, and Fine Gael would be more the economically,
Liberal Party, I guess.
yeah, the more economically liberal party. And over time, there hasn't really been a difference between these two parties, and you see the same kind of trend going on in, for example, my country, where you have the VVD, which is an more secular liberal party, and the CDA, which is a more Christian democratic party. And both of them kind of embrace more of um, more of a global outlook. They want more
Mm.
European Union. They want more immigration, and they tend to be because they tend to be more. They tend to kind of, um, especially on the issue of like Islam in Europe, they tend to be very um, it's very
Mm.
soft on the issue of Islam, particular because Islam and Christianity do kind of share the same tenets of being an Abrahamic religion, and so Christian Democrats are kind of worried that if we crack down on the Islamic growth in Europe, that they feel that that's a breach of religious freedom, and because
Mm.
of that, a lot of Christian Democrats tend to be very soft on the issue of the Islamization of Europe. And so I think in general, the Christian Democrats have become a bit too liberalized and moderate for my taste.
I see. I see.
But
But
when it comes to Eastern Europe, for example, Viktor Orban is more of a classical Christian Democrat, and that's kind of a model where I would go to.
I see. But many. My point was also when it comes to the cultural right of the Christian parties, for example, anti-abortion right, a certain anti-LGBT women's right. Is 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 this something you think the national populistic parties are gonna go to as well? Because they're still hanging out in the right wing, so that the
Mhm.
adaptation between the two groups is there. Like,
Yeah, yeah.
is that?
Um, I think on social issues, the national populists are kind of very divided. I think it really depends on like what the culture is of the country itself. If a country like Poland, for example, is still a lot more culturally conservative, so even the center right parties there still tend to be very pro life and generally doesn't don't really aren't really interested in LGBT issues. So, but when you look at, for example, the Netherlands, which is a country that is generally known for its more liberal stances, you
Yeah.
will see that a lot of the national populists actually kind of um, they actually don't really talk about abortion and they don't really talk about LGBT because those are kind of settled issues.
Ah,
So,
I see.
um, and a lot of the national populist parties like the PVV and Forum actually kind of appeal to LGBT and abortion as like values that should be protected from Islamic migration. So they fear that if Islamic immigration kind of takes over Europe, that the rights of LGBT people will be scaled back, and kind of national populist parties kind of they kind of focus on that issue to say if you want to protect like the liberal culture of the Netherlands, then you should want to restrict Muslim migration.
Yeah, and that's a bit of a double-edged sword usually, because if you vote on them, because obviously they're not going to get a majority, and many times if you vote for national populists, that means the Christian Democrats and other groups also have to be in that right-wing side. So to protect your liberal values, you have to still put them in somewhat of a risk by the right-wing parties to defend it from Islamification.
Yeah, exactly, and that's well, again, it kind of depends on the country, of course, because like in the Netherlands, there really isn't. a chance for like abortion and LGBT rights to be scaled back, because even like the parties on the right, aside from like a very aside from like a very small Calvinistic party, the issues are kind of like settled. Even though I would consider myself more pro-life, so that's kind of a shame. But I think um, it really depends on like the country you're talking about. If you're talking about like a country where the issue is still a lot more of a hot button issue, for example, Ireland maybe, then you could see, you know, those issues coming at the forefront inevitably if you vote the right in.
I see. You mentioned Calvinistic as well. So many parties in Europe, or Dutch I can imagine, has a certain religious connotation to it. You know, if you again point to the Christian Democrats, are they Christians? But do the national populists, in your opinion, have any religious influence as more settled down parties would have
No, I think, well, again, it kind of depends on
on the
the,
country, obviously?
yeah, on the culture of the country. But to kind of give to take my country as an example, the national populist parties are actually very secular, and I think there's generally kind of a lack of religion in these parties, because in my country, the most resistance from Islam doesn't necessarily come from Christianity, but it comes from kind of anti-religious sentiments. People who kind of value the idea of separation of church and state, and
Yeah,
they kind of fear that an Islamic takeover would kind of scale back, um, separation of church and state. So I think it's kind of interesting because the PVV, I would say, is very secular, and a big reason why um, these national populist parties kind of appeal to labor voters is because they generally keep religion there out of it.
yes,
But you also do see kind of a faction in the national populists that do kind of want a return towards religious morality. Not necessarily that they are religious themselves, but they want the cultural backbone of religion back. So, for example, Thierry Baudet, the leader of Forum for Democracy, he is an agnostic, but he considers himself a cultural Christian, for example. So, what you're kind of seeing is an alliance between the more secular sides and the more cultural Christian sides kind of joining together and seeing um, globalism and Islam in particular as kind of enemies of the West. And I think kind of this alliance is very interesting. I think it's because the West has a very, I think it really has to do with kind of the history of the West, because the West has um, for a very long time the West was Christian dominated, so it was dominated by the church, um, who kind of defined the culture of Europe. But then over time, it became a lot more secularized and liberalized with the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. So what you kind of see in the West is um, what we see as Western values is a very interesting mix between secularism and Christianity that we're now seeing kind of define the Western values that nationalists want to protect, if
yeah,
that makes
that
sense.
makes sense. So, is the Dutch parties influenced by the new right? Because your talk of secularism is usually a big part of it. Because I know Le Pen and Salvini, for example, are influenced by the new right. Is the Dutch as well?
Kind of depends on what you mean with the new right. Are you talking about like the French new right,
Well, more those thinkers, yes, through the two Frenchies.
kind of the identitarian?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I think I think Forum for Democracy, the political party that I'm a member of, definitely has Um, I definitely think there is kind of an identitarian streak in Forum for Democracy. For example, Thierry Baudet was very infamously caught having dinner with Jared Taylor, for example.
Okay.
So, but that was before he became a party leader. But that was very interesting to see, of course, because of Jared Taylor's kind of associations. So,
Yeah.
but you also can. Thierry Baudet is very into kind of the intellectual sides of right-wing thinking. So he definitely he's, for example, he's a protege of the late Roger Scruton. So he's very philosophically minded, and I think if you are very philosophically minded in politics, then and you're on the right, then I think it kind of becomes inevitable that you engage with identitarian thinking. So yeah, I think Forum for Democracy in particular has been very influenced with the kind of younger, new right identitarian ideas, not necessarily to a point where it defines the party, but you can see elements of it in the party. And but the PVV, on the other hand, doesn't really have that. The PVV is really more defined by um, how do we call it? Kind of the North FC stereotype, kind of the white trash, gammon, if you don't like it, you know where the door is, kind of right wing, the very stereotypical, more
Like
working
boomer
class.
civic nationalism.
Yeah, it's more like um, there isn't really a element of like new right in that party because it's just they don't really care much about the political theory. They're more interested in just like um, focusing on the really simple ideas. So, like for example, if you don't like it, you know where the door is. Full is full mentality, and so that's kind of interesting to see.
How's your party doing now in the Netherlands?
Um, well, it's been a very wild ride to say the least. Because this year, no, last year we had a provincial election, which also helps. The provincial election also kind of decides who gets the most seats in the Senate. So, and Forum for Democracy ended up winning. So they became the largest political party in the Senate. However, the party started getting some internal fighting around May because the co-founder Henk Otten um, is more of a is generally more seen as like the moderate branch of the party that wants to be like more pragmatic, and Thierry Baudet is more the ideological um, faction of the party that tends to kind of get in trouble, for example, with the Jared Taylor Association. So in the end, that tension between the two kind of went out of control, and Henk Otter split from the political party, and he took two other senators with him. So um, the Forum for Democracy ended up losing 3 seats, but because of the European elections and Brexit, they gained another Senate seat again. But that's just kind of really difficult politics. But the point is, the party saw a split, and because of that, they kind of tanked in the polls. They were no longer really the number one. And now the political polls in the Netherlands are like really fractured, where like the top five are like 1 seat apart from each other. So Forum for Democracy is kind of now in the joint third or fourth place, um, kind of behind the Labour Party, the Party for Freedom, and the VVD. So it's kind of, um, yeah, like I said, it's been a very wild ride. They at first they seemed like they were going to win next elections next year, but now it's kind of more we'll have to wait to see, basically.
Let's see. And what do you think your role in helping your party is? Do you only vote for them, or do you have any activism within the party?
I have done activism during the provincial elections. I hung up a couple of posters and I put a couple of flyers in the mailboxes of people because I was too shy to actually, go around and give them to people.
Let's see.
So,
Does your party do a lot of on-street activism?
what the party is more active on social media. They actually do a lot of things with Facebook and YouTube and Twitter, and they actually have like a America First with Nick Fuentes style
Oh,
show
really?
actually, where they actually get super chats and stuff.
Oh, is it in Dutch or English?
It's in Dutch,
Ah,
but it's kind of funny how a political party just kind of like gets super chats.
how
But
many?
they are really active on social media, and sometimes they do political conferences around the country. So they go around and they have like jam-packed audiences where they just like they just hear a couple of speakers, speak at like an event. But they had to be cancelled due to the virus
Yeah,
recently. So,
the virus.
but yeah, the
Oof.
Forum for Democracy is probably like the most active political party when it comes to like events and social media, and I think that's the reason why they've become one of the biggest parties despite being only a few years old.
How many percentages in prediction do your party have? Like, if it was election
Well,
today.
our political polls don't really measure in percentages; they measure
Ah,
in seats.
okay.
So right now in the polls, the biggest political party is the VVD, which is also currently the ruling party of our prime minister. It means People's Party for Freedom and Democracy, so that's why I shorten it to VVD. But they are the biggest, and they currently have in the polls 20 seats, which is actually a very big decline.
Ah,
So they
sure.
are kind of hanging on right now. Um, Second biggest party is the PVV, which is the political party of Geert Wilders, and they are currently at 90 seats. Then you have the Labour Party, which has kind of made a comeback, and they are around 70 seats. And finally, on the fourth place, there's Forum with 16 seats, and then there are like 10 other more parties with seats. So Forum for Democracy is definitely like at the upper tier right now with 16 seats in the polls around there right now.
Wow.
And last election they won only like 2 seats,
Yeah,
so it's a very big increase.
it's a big increase indeed.
I noticed that in the polls, like the Netherlands tends to be one of the few countries that doesn't have like a green wave like the rest of the.
Yeah, the green wave actually kind of happened last time because the Labour Party just kind of tanked and dropped to like 8 seats, and because of that, a lot of the left wing voters opted to go to the Green Party. But now that the Labour Party has kind of been making a comeback, the Green Party hasn't really been doing so well anymore. And there's also been a lot of like anti-environmental tendencies in the Netherlands. We've had the farmers' protests where like thousands of tractors were
Yeah.
just heading to the cities in the Netherlands. So a lot of like the protest of farmers against like environmental regulations which hurt their businesses kind of led to a very anti-green sentiment in the Netherlands right now.
And the insane part is no other European country hears about this on the news. It's a big, massive amount of trucks driving right up to Parliament, but no other European country reads about it because it's not being written down.
Yeah, true. The media is very selective about the kind of protests that they actually cover. For example, the Yellow Vest protest has been going on for like
Over a
two
year.
years now, I think, and the media just doesn't give a shit.
No.
But when it comes to like protests in countries that are the enemy of the US, that gets instant attention. Like people love to hype up, for example, protests in Iran when the vast majority of the population in Iran supports their government. But when it comes to like protests in France and Macron trying to like silence it with violence, it doesn't really get any of the same attention because they're U.S. allies, and we can't have the narrative that U.S. allies are just as authoritarian.
Oh boy. So I want to go and talk about a little bit more about religion now for a little while. So
Oh yeah, sure.
I always thought you were Catholic, which surprised me. But you said you're something called a reformer or reformer.
Uh, yeah, what I follow, the Christian idea denomination that I follow is it's generally more known as Calvinism,
Yeah.
um, but it's actually more part of a broader denomination, what you can call Reformed theology, and that's kind of that follows the ideas of John Calvin, but also like theologians from Switzerland, for example, like Zwingli. So, and the reason why it's called Reformed is because Martin Luther was more of a moderate reformer. He
Yes.
wanted to reform the Catholic Church, but he didn't want to leave the church.
Yes.
He wanted to improve the church, and he got kicked out. So he still considered himself to be a Catholic, not a Lutheran. And the Reformed, on the other hand, like Calvin and Zwingli, they wanted to separate from the church. They thought us too corrupt, and they had very different ideas of what the church should look like. And that's why they are called the Reformed rather than, the Lutherans.
Yeah. And I'm guessing a lot of this has to do with the relationship between the Netherlands and the Catholic Church, where there were many, like the first Bibles that were not written in Latin, well, not the first particular, but the first modern ones, but written in Dutch by Dutch writers. And they were hunted down by the Catholic Church and killed for writing the
Yeah,
Bible in Dutch. I'm guessing this has a lot to do with how the reformers took place because of the bad relationship between the church and them.
yeah. It also has a lot to do with the fact that we are very close to Germany, which is where the Reformation started, of course.
Yeah.
But it was also it also has to do a lot with when we achieved independence, because we were ruled by Spain for a while, and
You
Spain
were,
was very Catholic, of course, it still is,
you were ruled by
and our
Spain?
king, um, or at least the um, the person who kind of ruled over the territory of Spain back then, which is now the Netherlands, he was very sympathetic to the Reformed. So um, he ended up deciding that he had to separate from the Spanish authorities because even though he kind of respected the divine rights of the king, he believed that the Catholic Church and the Catholic influence of the Netherlands was too corrupt, and so in the end, it kind of all led to Dutch independence, and that kind of caused a schism between the northern parts of the Netherlands, which was more Protestant, and the southern parts of the Netherlands, which is more Catholic. And over time, a lot of Protestants who were being persecuted by Catholics around, like the feudal states in the Holy Roman Empire, for example, they all kind of fled to the Netherlands, which was known for its more religious tolerance. So
Didn't the
over time,
Netherlands have a Puritan concepts as well, if I'm correct? Or is that just
uh,
England?
well, we weren't really Puritans. I think Puritan is more of a specific denomination
Yeah,
that
it
was
is,
in
but I said
England.
more of meaning a sort of radical Protestant group.
Um, well, Yeah, to an extent. Thing is, like the Netherlands is technically known for its religious tolerance, but when we talk about religious tolerance, it's more like all religions are equal, but the Protestants are more equal than others. So um, probably there was a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment in the Netherlands, and also a lot of like radical Protestant ideas. And probably the most radical moment in the Netherlands was known as the Beeldenstorm, which was where a bunch of Calvinists decided to just destroy a bunch of statues and paintings and all kinds of like religious iconography because the Reformed considered statues and images of Jesus and stuff to be idolatry.
Oh,
So there was kind of like a mass destruction of like statues and paintings in particular, and also churches. That's why it's called the Beeldenstorm, because beeld is Dutch for statue, and they just kind of destroyed it in a storm, basically.
oh boy.
So, the Netherlands always kind of likes to praise its idea of like religious tolerance, but the Protestants weren't always that much better than the Catholics at some times.
Yeah. Oof. And how are relations today between the two groups?
A lot better. I think in the 20th century, with the kind of the rise of secularism, that kind of forced uh, religious groups to kind of form a more of a general Christian identity. So,
Yeah, yeah, and I've seen that too.
so it's not really people aren't really known as Catholic and Protestants much anymore, more than they are generally considered to be Christian.
All right. So the
But you
set.
can so the Catholic and Protestant divide is now more kind of a regional thing.
I see. So it's not like the Americans, which are like where the Protestants don't call the Catholics Christians; they just call them Catholics.
Wait, can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah,
Go
sure.
ahead.
You said that the South was more Catholic. Then how come most of the SGP strongholds are in the South?
Well, it's not really that South that I'm talking about. When I talk about South, I mean two provinces: the province of Limburg and the province of North Brabant. Those are two provinces that um, it's a very complicated border issue. Back when like France and England had to like create buffer states, so I won't really go into detail. But Limburg and Brabant are provinces that have more similarities with like the Flemish side of Belgium, and
Yeah.
that's the reason why they tend to be more Catholic compared to the north. And it also has to kind of do with the boundaries between a river. So, for example, a the those are like um, provinces in the more east south. So it's better to be said that Catholicism in the Netherlands is more on the southeast. Um, the more reformed and the more dedicated Protestant groups are more in the western sides, you could say. They're kind of all over the place. But for example, Zeeland, which is also a southern province, but on the west side, is very Protestant. So um, when it comes to like very Protestant groups, they tend to be more in the middle to western south. Well, the and of course in the north in general. Why? Well, the Catholics are generally known to be in North Brabant and Limburg.
Hmm.
I see.
So your reformed group, how are they on social issues? Are they conservative in their social issues?
Um, They tend to have, well, I'm part of what you could say the Protestant Church of the Netherlands, which is like a ecumenical church that combine that has like Reformed and Lutherans.
Yeah, yeah.
But this church does, um, well, this church has kind of a policy of like, we'll just let the local churches handle it. We won't say how those churches should do their business. So you tend to have like a very liberal and a very conservative faction of like the churches. So the more liberal Protestants tend to be, more on the liberal side of issues like same-sex marriage and abortion. Um, I don't really know why they do this because the Bible clearly doesn't really condone those things, but they'll probably take some Bible verses out of context. But it's generally, I think, more of a cultural thing rather than like a theological dispute. So you do see there is like um, I do think like Protestants in general are lean more conservative, but there is also a very like liberal branch of it. So that's generally kind of the how it goes in the Protestant church at least. But there are also like smaller, more dedicated Reformed churches um, that kind of split off from the broader Protestant church because they didn't really want to be associated with different denominations, and they tend to be very conservative. And probably the most conservative um, Calvinist group
Mm-hmm.
is the what you could call the political party is the um, I'm not really sure how you call them in English, but they are. I generally call them the Calvinist Party,
Okay.
and they are the oldest political party in the Netherlands
Oh.
that is still active in parliament. And they actually split from a different Calvinist party because they disagreed with the issue of women's suffrage,
Oh.
and they actually held that like stance for a very long time. Like I'm talking into the 21st century. They've always maintained this belief that women shouldn't be allowed in politics because there's like a separate but equal mentality between men and women. So it wasn't until like 2006 that women weren't allowed to be politicians in the party, basically.
Oof.
And they also, of course, tend to have the typical socially conservative ideas such as pro-life and anti-same-sex marriage. So it's very complicated. Basically, there are conservative and liberal factions. You can kind of compare it to like the mainline Protestants versus the evangelicals in the U.S.
Yeah, I understand. And you, well, you're not, you don't think like these people do with political
No,
matters.
well, I wouldn't consider myself as conservative as them. No, but that's of course that kind of also brings us to another thing. One thing about Protestants is that like they like to split up a lot. They really like to split up in like very completely different denominations over like the smallest issues.
Yep.
So we also have different types of reformed. And so, for example, you have the Hervormed, which is like reform instead of reform. I know it's very complicated, but basically you have the Hervormed, which are the more moderate reformed denomination, which is um, the Protestant Church of the Netherlands, kind of is based around like Hervormed. Then you have the Gereformeerd, which are the more conservative groups. They tend to be more strict about certain issues on whether you should be allowed to do things on Sunday or anything like that. And then you have the Reformed Liberated, and they are like very ultra conservative and very almost kind of comparable to the Amish in a
Oh,
sense. Not necessarily in terms of like technology, but just in very strictness.
yeah,
And
they're
we, at least my mother used to be used to live in a very religious household, and she told me that the basic difference between the Hervormd and the Gereformeerd is basically that the Hervormd the Hervormd basically put out their like because they had to dry their clothes back then outside, with the wind, to kind of dry their clothes, and so the Hervormd would there was basically a saying that the Hervormd would hang their clothes outside on Sunday so that they could dry, and the Gereformeerd would say that they are not allowed to do that because it's Sunday and they have to rest, but they would hang the clothes inside so people wouldn't see it. So that kind of explains the difference in the mentality.
yeah small.
And I am basically more on the Reformed side, kind of a more moderate
Oh,
idea of Reformed theology.
I see. And because you're moderate, does this conflict with your transsexuality at all?
No, I don't actually consider Christianity to conflict with my identity, um, mainly because the thing about that people kind of misunderstand about Christianity is the issue of sin. Because basically, the whole point of Christianity is that nobody is free from sin. I'm Calvinist, so I take the view of total depravity. That basically means that no human is possible of achieving salvation by themselves. Nobody is capable of freeing themselves of sin um, because of the fall of man. So, um, but that's of course where the sacrifice of Christ comes in, because people couldn't really get into heaven due to original sin. Jesus basically, the one person who did not have sin, decided to take the punishment that was supposed to be given to us for sinning, and he took that punishment for us. That's the whole point of the sacrifice. He died for your sins. And so that means that as long as we accept the sacrifice of Christ, as long as we accept that he, died for our sins, um, if you do that, and if you truly believe that, if you truly have faith in that he sacrificed himself for us, then you can achieve salvation. Then your sins will be forgiven. So my identity is definitely a sin, but because I have faith in Christ that he will save me, I believe that even though I live in sin, including my identity, that it will be forgiven. So that's kind of, and Protestants believe in the concept of salvation through faith alone. So,
Yeah.
um, and I forgot what the Bible verse is, but that was kind of the thing that um, ended up making me go to Christianity. It was in Mark, I do know that, but it basically was a Bible verse where Jesus said that doctors do not come to treat the healthy; they come to treat the sick. And Jesus said that he didn't come for the healthy, but for the sick. He came for the sinners, not the perfect people. And I'm really sorry for completely fucking up that Bible verse,
Don't worry about that. So
but
if I'm being evil, then so as long as I believe in God and my salvation through God, I can go around killing my neighbors.
no, that's not how it works.
No, I'm obviously being a bit rude, but
Yeah, yeah. But,
where does the line of sinning go? How mu-
um, yeah, of course, that's a very good question. Well, if you really want to get into Calvinist theology, we don't even really believe that we can. Um, Calvinists basically believe that God chooses already who goes to heaven and hell beforehand. But
Yeah.
that's like a whole different rabbit hole that I won't be
Yes,
discussing here. So
determination. Yeah, that I know already. That's
yeah,
kind of
the
but
but that's like a rabbit hole that always causes a shitstorm. So
no, it's a fascinating rabbit hole, but that's a long discussion. We can talk about that
yeah, it's
for
a
quite
very
a
long
while.
discussion. So I
Yes.
kind of so instead I will be focusing more on the concept of faith alone.
Yeah.
I think that's a more interesting topic and easier to explain because so basically a lot of people think that by faith alone is basically a get out of jail free card. That you can basically like be like, okay, I can sin all I want and not believe in him, and then like 3 minutes before I die, I'm like,
Yeah.
oh please Jesus, and then I will be saved. That's not necessarily how it works, because do have to you do have to genuinely believe that what you did was wrong. That's the sin that you engaged with. You really have to justify um, that the murder you did was unjustified and that it was completely wrong and immoral, and that you genuinely want to be saved and become a better person to justify your faith. So, for example, if you had a really rough life and you ended up killing someone for reasons unknown, maybe the person really hated someone or they just had to out of self-defense.
Yeah.
In any case, he committed murder. Now, if he were to say, if he enjoyed the murder and if he still enjoys murdering people, and if he says, well, if I just say I want to be saved by Jesus,
Yeah.
then I will be saved, then he won't be saved because that faith isn't justified. He doesn't have remorse for the killing that he did. But if he genuinely feels remorse for what he did, for the murder that he did, and he really goes to Christ to become a better person, then he can be saved.
But is remorse a good enough punishment for murder? Because yeah, I can murder and I can feel horrible about it for the next 10 years. But does me feeling bad about it and believing in God, that is, punish me enough for the sins that I've committed?
Well, I guess that would deter you from doing it again, I guess.
I guess, but I know that in the end, God is a judge, and I know in Calvinism it's already your
Yeah, yeah,
what you God already knows what you will do because there is no time with God because time already happened. So it's just that I know God already had a judgment for you when you're born.
yeah.
But in the end of the day, still like where would, if we hypothetically speak, God draw that line on when someone is punished and when someone is not punished? Because we know, for example, that many Christians, very believing Christians, like God-fearing Christians, are sometimes the worst sinners. So just because they're God-fearing Christians, would that then forgive them for sin? Would God not punish them for the sin they have committed?
No, because Christ already sacrificed himself. He took the punishment for the sins that we committed. So
Oh, so God is not
um,
giving a punishment for a bad man, even if he's a God-fearing Christian.
no, if a bad person has committed a very horrible sin, but he feels very remorseful for it and wants to become a better person as a Christian, then he will not be punished because Christ already took the punishment for him. So I think it's kind of up to humans
To punish.
um, to give a kind of justified punishment for him.
I see. For
But
many, I can imagine, for many that would not be fair. They would not feel that that's a fair thing for a God to do.
yeah, and that's actually kind of the thing that I wanted to touch on. A lot of people would probably feel it's very weird for God not to punish a person who committed a murder. But you also have to kind of understand that the way we see sins is very different from the way that a omnipotent being would see sins. So we, of course, for example, see murder as a lot worse than lying or stealing or any mild sin or adult or like you know committing adultery with your heart. We have very we generally separate these things into like different degrees of how bad it is.
Yeah.
But that's because we see the sins from our perspective as very um, potent beings. So even though we commit sins, we all do, we consider our sins to be less bad than someone who murders. That is from our moral perspective.
Yeah.
But when you compare that to someone who is infinitely good, then in his eyes there really is no difference between any kind of sin. In our eyes, because he is infinitely good, he can only see the sinful aspects of humanity in a kind of an absolute way. It's kind of like trying to say who is more evil, Hitler or Stalin. Well, Stalin maybe because he killed more people overall, but we generally see these two as so evil in comparison that it's not even really that useful to say who's more evil.
I understand that. Geez, that for many that would be, they would not want your religion at all if that's if that's the truth, because me jerking off once is equally as bad as a mass murderer
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
or a
Well,
rapist.
again, you have to kind of that feels bad because you see it from the perspective of a morally flawed human. But if you compare that to an infinitely good being, then it makes a lot more sense to see all sins as evil in comparison.
That's
It's kind of no, well, at first it sounds really bad, but
yeah,
then you
it
also
is.
have to but you also have to kind of consider that God, that despite the fact that that we are so depraved compared to God, that He still gives us a way to be saved.
Well, you're not selling me on the religion, but you're not doing missionary work. But um,
Well, yeah, the thing is,
that's yeah,
the thing is, like a lot of people like to portray Christianity as like they try to sugarcoat Christianity as like this beautiful
yeah.
religion all about like compassion and tolerance, and it's really not. Christianity is a very bitter pill to take, and that's probably a reason why I won't be a preacher anytime soon. But it really is a you really don't need to become a Christian to feel better about yourself because you won't. The more you actually read into the Bible and theology, you'll basically realize that you are a morally depraved being. But at the same time, it's also um, at the same time, it for me, it's there's a certain I'm not really sure how to explain it. But there is something comforting about the fact that there is a morally perfect being that loves me so much that despite my flaws and despite my sins, they are still willing to um, they are still willing to give me a pathway to salvation, and that's kind of the comforting aspect of Christianity in what's generally more of a bitter message otherwise.
I usually say one of the core tendencies of Christianity is suffering, and as humans, you suffer, but through God's salvation, He will free you from suffering once you have suffered, meaning in this life.
Yeah, yeah.
And would you agree on that statement? Because
Yeah, I think I would agree with the statement. I think what people have really have to accept is the fact that there really aren't any. yeah, we really aren't, in comparison to an infinitely good being, we are just completely depraved. We are totally depraved. We are unable to free ourselves from sin. But that, in another way, is also very humbling because it kind of makes you realize that, yeah, we aren't perfect beings. We shouldn't try to set up some kind of political utopia. Um, we shouldn't rely on cults of personality. We should humble ourselves and try to strive to be better people
Yeah.
in spite of the sins that we struggle through. And if we do that, then we can achieve salvation.
And do you think politically we should focus more on Christianity or more secular ideas and through faith alone, but not through politics and changing
Uh,
society is good enough to help majority more people?
um, I think it's a very difficult issue because one of the aspects of Christianity that I do find pretty troubling is kind of the universalistic tendencies of Christianity, the tendency to, do missionary work and to go around the
Mm.
globe. And that aspect of Christianity always kind of downplays the more particularistic nationalistic ideals. So I think politically, I don't think we should become like theocracy necessarily, or we should all force people to become Christian religiously. But I do think that there are a lot of cultural aspects about Christianity and kind of the metaphysical or sociological aspects of Christianity. I think those aspects are very important to bring back to Europe so that there is generally kind of a common identity again. And so, what at least my take on kind of modern politics is that I agree with Friedrich Nietzsche's
Huh.
diagnosis that God is dead, in Europe at least. Um, and because of the death of God, or at least the death of Christendom, what we've seen is we've lost the aspect of original sin. We have lost the aspect of depravity. So we no longer see humans as sinful beings, as flawed beings, but we see humans as beings with infinite potential, basically. And you especially saw that with the Enlightenment. Like Rousseau, for example, he really believed in this concept of man breaking its chains and kind of becoming a perfect being. And um, I think a lot of modern utopian political projects, from communism to global liberalism,
Yeah.
they all kind of have the same narrative of humans becoming almost godlike in a
Mm.
sense, that they strive towards an end of history, whether that's the Marxist end of history or the liberal end of history, and it always just kind of ends up making humans kind of perfect beings. And I think that mentality, the reason why we are seeing this um, during the decline of Christendom, isn't really a coincidence. I think the loss of original sin gave away to this idea of um, human perfection. And I think that has been a very dangerous mentality to Europe and to the West, because I think I generally prefer the idea of cyclical history of Oswald Spengler. So
Yeah.
I generally dislike the idea of linear history and that humans can progress to a perfect being. I think um, that can only kind of lead to disaster.
Mm. So with less focus on religion and more focus on human in the center and human to be godlike, what the humans are doing is building a new Tower of Babel, in other words.
Yeah, yeah. In a sense,
And do you think God will punish?
no, I don't necessarily think so. I think if Western civilization ends up falling due to this mentality, I think it will generally just be due to the life cycle of civilization itself. I think the cycle will just kind of repeat naturally. I don't think that will lead to any intervention necessarily.
Let's see. All right. My questions are done there, and I'm quite happy. Naspel, do you have a last question you want to ask Michelle?
No, you kind of already asked them.
Fair enough. Then, any final statement you want to say before we end this, Michelle?
Yeah, sure. I want to thank you for allowing me to be on a podcast. It's been very interesting. I'm still generally pretty new at religion and Christianity. I've only become one this year, so
I do want to talk about that more in the future, but I will do
yeah,
it
it's
in a
gonna be
more of
interesting.
me like because I'm going to have a Catholic on next.
Oh boy, oh
Next,
boy,
yeah, yeah, and
oh
we
god.
are going to talk about
Oof,
the essence of.
big oof.
I know we're going to talk a bit about the essence of God, sin, and then back to real life politics or whatever.
Hmm.
So it's
Well, yeah,
interesting talking to a Calvinistic Protestant now. I'll see how next week it looks with a Catholic.
yeah, and the thing is, because I'm very new at religion, my knowledge about theology and the meat of Calvinist theology and all that kind of stuff. I'm very new about like talking about it, so a lot of what I said here, this is kind of the first time I really openly talk in a podcast about or stream about Christianity. So kind of my um, the things I wanted to say about Christianity and theology were a lot more rambly and amateurish compared to like politics,
Yeah,
which I'm kind of more familiar with.
no worries. I think in the future we'll have you on together with somebody else, and you can defend like what I want to talk about in the future about predestination, because that's a big topic one can go into for quite a while.
Yeah, that is arguably one of the most controversial aspects of like Calvinism.
Yeah, indeed. So again, thank you. It was really fun, and I hope to see you more in the future. And everybody who watched, and anybody who watched, thank you very much. And I hope to see you all in the future. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
I